So, quiet, 3, 2, 1, and we're live. Good morning, everyone. Before introducing myself, if you want to follow this session in English, you can access one of the links on the chat, the link for English. And we have great pleasure to start another special session at Brazil Water Week. This week is promoted by Águas. It's the most important water event, international water event that happens in Brazil. These special sessions are free and open to the audience, and they will be happening today and tomorrow. You can access the link through the chat to register for other sessions. From October 26 to October 30, we will have Brazil Water Week, 5 full days with over 50 hours of content online and over 100 experts from Brazil and from other 16 countries. You can also find the website for registration on the chat. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Sabesp, Umia, Suez, Ana, Aegea, Sedai, and Iguá Saneamento. I'd like to invite our colleagues to say good morning to our participants. So first, Maria, could you please say good morning to our audience for everyone watching us at home?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria. I work for you in water. I will get back to you in a short while on some of the SDG 6 indicators. I'm very happy to be here and that you're also here. Thanks.
Marcus, could you say hello? Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Angelo, Maria. It is a great pleasure to be here in this session, sharing with you our experience regarding the indicators of SDG 6. I hope we'll all have a great session. Thank you. Rafael? Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity for discussing this topic that is so important. Thank you for the opportunity once more, and I hope we will have a great discussion here today. This topic is really important for all of us. Anilvaldo Miranda. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here participating. I live in Maceió, where we have the seat for the San Francisco River Water Basin. And it's a great opportunity to be here discussing our work as the committee for this basin and related to the Sustainable Development Goal. I hope we'll have a very productive session here today. So good morning to all. Thank you all. I'm Angelo Lima. I am the Executive Secretary of the Water Governance Observatory, and I'll be playing the role of moderator on this debate. The topic is monitoring and information on SDG, particularly indicators 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, and 6.8. There we'll be discussing water resources. We know that SDGs are integrated. They come from several topics, but today our focus is on the monitoring and information on water resources. We'll also be sharing some experiences of actions that have been performed or that are being implemented to support these indicators and the debate with promoting the SDGs. So thank you very much for participating. If you're watching us, feel free to ask questions using the chat, and at the end of the presentation we will have our speakers answer the questions. So feel free to use the chat to ask any questions. let's move on now to Maria Schade. She has already introduced herself. She is the Global Monitoring Specialist from UN Water. So Maria Schade, you have 10 minutes. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and for participating here in Brazil Water Week.
Thanks so much. The pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I can hear the English translation of myself though. Not sure why that is. Yes, thanks so much. So for those of you who don't know it, UN Water, it's not an agency, it's a coordination mechanism within the UN system. And we bring together all the UN agencies that work with water and sanitation. So that's good to have in mind. One of our focus areas, it's monitoring and reporting, as there are very many UN agencies that are involved in this. And today I've been asked to just briefly cover these, the monitoring of the indicators 6.3.1 to up to 6A1 and 6B1, I think too. These cover the water resources management aspects of the SDGs, of the SDG 6, and also the enabling environment. I do hope that you are all, you know a bit about the SDGs by now, and also SDG 6. Used to, highlight that the monitoring and reporting, it's an integral part
of que isso daí é uma parte integral da agenda dos
make sure that it
ODS,
actually
para ter
moves
certeza
forward.
que estão
We
indo para a direção correta
to feed into these follow-up
para poder alimentar esses
which then
recursos.
inform the means of implementation, so the finance, the
Então,
technology.
as finanças, a tecnologia que são necessárias para implementar todos esses objetivos.
So it's basically an iterative process for making it happen. We have these global
Nós
indicators.
temos esses indicadores globais.
I'm hearing the Portuguese translation as I speak. I'm not sure if
Eu
that.
espero que vocês estejam ouvindo a tradução em português, não tenho certeza se vocês estão conseguindo acompanhar.
Just wanted to highlight that these
Só queria
indicators
ressaltar que esses indicadores
to broadly
foram
track
usados
what we're doing.
amplamente para rastrear
With
todo o
one
trabalho
number
que
per
temos feito,
indicator per country, they are
um indicador por
powerful
país,
needs and
com as
to
necessidades poderosas da região
stakeholders, to
e
different
capacidade
stakeholders.
de trabalhar com os diferentes participantes em cada nível de cada país.
More detailed,
Mas, para mais detalhes,
informed policy and decision making at
para
national level,
criação, para tomada de decisões no nível internacional,
with much more
nós precisamos muito mais
detailed
indicadores
that are disaggregated
que não são agregados.
context. Within the 2030 agenda, it's specified that
E
that the follow-up and
as
review is
especificações,
based on national data.
vamos ver que é baseado em dados nacionais.
Possible to submit data on
E é
the
possível enviar os dados,
and they do so to custodian
eles
agencies,
fazem para agências, custódia, que são agências
appointed
que
as
foram
the
designadas como
indicator.
responsáveis para esses indicadores.
They are the ones who have
Eles são os que têm
proposed methodologies that are
as
and
metodologias
they are also responsible for
e também
providing different types of
responsáveis por
capacity support
oferecer
to countries.
todo o apoio e supervisão dessas políticas.
And I will come back to that in a bit.
Eu vou voltar em poucos minutos.
Are all the indicators for SDG 6?
O áudio está saindo na transmissão, não está.
Yes, okay.
Está sem som, Maria, por favor.
Sorry?
Tem algum problema no som?
Oh, okay.
We had a bit of a technical issue. You can continue. It's the interpreting side. You can continue normally.
No, that's great.
Canais.
Yes. So the WASH indicators on drinking
Não
water
ouço a tradução.
have been around since the MDG period, and there was already this initiative in place to take care of it, the JMP. Also for 6A and 6B, this have been taken care of also before the SDG period by GLAS, a young water initiative that's carried out by WHO. And then for these new indicators on water resource management, there were already different initiatives in place, but they had never before been really, systematically collecting data on these indicators before the SDGs. And what we did within Young Water was to bring together all the custodian agencies for these indicators and form this Young Water Integrated Monitoring Initiative. So, each indicator, as you can see, there's also the custodian agencies that are listed here. It's actually, it's 11 different indicators and it's 11 different custodian agencies. So it's a lot of people involved, and to make sure that we streamline our work and not put extra burden on countries, we have formed this initiative. And so there's things that the custodian agencies are doing themselves, reaching out, collecting data. But then there's also a lot of things that we're doing together as a whole, especially when we look at how we communicate, how we reach out to countries, and how we then use the data for reporting. I don't have time to go into any depth about this, but just to note that we started in before 2015 with the methodology development and testing. And then in 2017, there was this first round of baseline data collection. And there was also reports, of course. Right now, we're in the second phase. And this year, it's the second big global data drive where the custodian agencies are reaching out to countries to gather data. There are a number of big events that are coming up. So we're just now wrapping up this data drive. And next year we will be producing reports on this to inform a number of high-level events, which you see listed here. When we collect data from countries, there's basically two streams. So one, it's when the custodian agencies compile data from countries that are already available. They use this already available data to produce estimates, which then are sent back to countries for them to validate. And what's very important, since it's the formal reporting to the SDGs, it needs the country approval. This is the case for the indicators on drinking water, on sanitation, on wastewater to a certain extent, for ecosystems based on Earth observation data, and also on the indicator on official development aid. Then the other stream, it's basically reaching out to countries and asking them to submit their data, either existing or new. It's usually done in the form of a questionnaire. The country compiles the data, submits it to the custodian agency, who then supports the validation of the data, and finally the sign off and the publication. And this is the case for most of the water resources managed, or actually, yeah, all of them, all the water resources management indicators. And here we can separate between two different types of indicators. So we have those that the outcome indicators, how much water we're using, how much wastewater we let out. This is, very resource intensive indicators to monitor, which relies on countries having a certain infrastructure for monitoring. And then we have these process indicators, which looks at, for example, on integrated water resource management and transboundary cooperation, which basically requires that a lot of stakeholders gather to take stock of the situation. And this is also the case for the indicator 6B1 on stakeholders. So basically, these are the two main streams. I don't have time to go into any detail about the monitoring of each of the water resources indicators, but I just wanted to take one example. And also, as I mentioned, especially the outcome indicators are very difficult for countries. In many countries, this infrastructure is not available. And what we are proposing there, it's this monitoring ladder, or the steps of progressive monitoring, where countries can start with simplified methods or estimates, And then as their capacity increases, they can improve the monitoring. So with example of indicator 661 on water resource management, on ecosystem, the extent of ecosystem and the health. Of course, if you want to have an understanding of how the ecosystems are doing, you need to go out in the field and do measurements, measuring the flows of water, the quality, looking at ecosystem health. It's a lot of in situ work. And what we saw during the first round of data collection, so this is one of the components of ecosystem. I think it's wetland extent, one of the components of indicator 661. And we got response on that from 3 countries. And if we look at all the aspects of ecosystem extent, we had responses from about 40 countries. The same thing with, this is the water quality indicator. Also, very few countries were in a position to respond to this indicator. And if we dig down and look at what countries responded, so this is a slightly complicated chart, but basically you see the number of monitoring locations and the number of monitoring values on the y-axis. And what we can see here is that there was a lot of countries who reported a value on water quality for the entire country based on used very few values, sometimes less than 10 monitoring stations and values. So this, it's a major challenge for countries. What the custodian agency did to overcome this in the case of the ecosystems, it's that they moved to use Earth observations. And now, of course, there are many drawbacks with Earth observation data, but it's used in comparison to these 40 countries reporting some kind of value on some part of the indicator. Now they have estimates on multiple indicators down to, I think it's 15-second grid. So basically for each water basin, each city, you can zoom in and see the current status, for example, on turbidity or mangroves. This is just an example, but how we're working to gather data where
Maria,
it is scarce. And I'm
por
running out of
favor, minuto.
Maria, just 1 second, please.
1 second. Sorry. So I will skip through these ones, use some examples. And what I wanted to show you at the very end was where you can find all this data. I will stop sharing this one and I will start sharing my web page instead. So we have gathered all the data that's available for all countries and all the SDG indicators in this SDG6 data portal. So I would invite you to look at the data that's available. We have it, for example, by indicator and also by country. So you can click on the country you're interested in and see the latest data we have. Of course, as I mentioned, we're currently this year collecting new data. So what you find here right now, it dates a few years back, but we will update this as soon as possible. And with that, thanks so much for your attention, and I'm sorry for using a bit more time. Thanks.
Thank you, Maria. Unfortunately, there's a lot of elements to be talked about and a lot of actions that can be presented. And later on, we can definitely get deeper on these topics through a discussion. And on the website, everything can be found, all those data can be found, everything that was collected, and that's extremely important. So information is definitely a crucial element for us in order to cooperate with the SDGs. All right, thank you so much again, Maria. Now, let's go to Marcus Fuckner. Marcus Fuckner, his function is at the National Water Agency and a National Sanitation Agency. He's specialist in geoprocessing. He's also a coordinator for management for water management and the planning for all water resources. So, Marcos, thank you so much for your presence. You have 10 minutes. Thank you, Angelo.
Global framework that we are integrated here in Brazil. Nice to meet you here. Bom, pessoal, eu vou procurar
Well,
agora.
everyone, what I'm going to do now to try and talk about what Maria has brought to us, the reality of an integrated process. And we do that for the SDGs towards water resources with different countries that are countries and that are members of the United Nations. And now let's share our reality in Brazil, how we're doing the monitoring in Brazil. What's the current situation in our country? What's the ANA's role in this monitoring task? And also, I'm going to share my screen, and that's my presentation. So we can go ahead and
Né, compartilhar
get
um
started, and I can explain and share a little bit about our history, about the work that we're developing in this session. All right, everyone can see the presentation. All right, let's keep going. So as Angelo has introduced me, I don't need to introduce myself. So we know we have just a few minutes, and let's see what ANA has done and what its role when it comes to water resources indicators here in Brazil. And just like Maria has presented on her area and in her presentation, all the work is integrated to a monitoring activity that's coordinated by the United Nations Water Resources, and you can see under SDG 6, but there's also under custodial agencies such as PNUMA, such as UNICEF, UNESCO, and UNS, and other institutions. And specifically here at ANA, we're the focal point for most of the SDG indicators, many of those that are in green, as you can see on the screen, and that's our focus in Brazil. When it comes to the other indicators, especially the ones that have to do with water, sanitation, and the later ones, the last ones that has to do with the methodology and the data collection that's going to happen next year, we have made our calculation. We have some proposals for those indicators. However, it's always integrated with other institutions. And in Brazil's case, we have IBGEs. We also have the Department of Health or Regional Development and CPRM, which is our Geological Services Agency in Brazil. And in the entire process that started from the conception of the SDGs 2030 that has to do with previous process related to sustainable development. So we launched in 2018 the first report for Brazil at ANA about the SDG 6, just along with the health department, other departments in Brazil that oversaw these SDGs back then. So that report was a foundation for us to come up with the first monitoring of indicators throughout Brazil. And all of the 8 goals within the SDG, as you can see in that graph, in that image. And there's also a link where you can see. And as a report format, there's a panel of indicators where all that information can be checked, can be seen very easily. It's readily available if you want to see it. Now, what's interesting to point out is that in the specific year of 2020, we're trying to update the failing gaps in the calculation of the SDG 6 for Brazil, because all methodologies, they are getting improved, the indicators are getting improved, so reality is getting closer and closer to other countries who are part of these discussions, along with the United Nations and custodial agencies. So by 2030, we're getting closer and closer to that monitoring ideal. And also, it's interesting to mention what's the flow, what's our workflow for monitoring these SDG 6 indicators. And one of the elements, the key elements we have is the conjuncture report itself. Many of you might already have heard about it. And that report, it's a technical basis, technical foundation to see the evolution of our areas, how everything is improving. So the basis of everything we do is along with our information portal for environmental activities, and also feeds into our environmental economic accounting system, and ANA works along with IBG. And at last, it also feeds information to a lot of indicators that are calculated by ANA, and that goes from custodian agencies to the United Nations Statistics Agency and to other agencies in Latin America, among others. So that process is going to contribute to a SDG 6 monitoring in Brazil. And at last, that monitoring has been done so far through reports, publications, and next year we intend to come up with a new publication, of course, pending approvals in an integrated form with approvals and the different proposals that have been
Slide detalha um
presented
pouco
to us so far. So now you can see the entire conjuncture process in December. We have the 2020 conjuncture report, and next year this report will be integrated to the new water resources see and the quality of water resources. And you can see as 6.2 talked about the proportion of those water bases, the quality of water that we monitor in Brazil. And there's a big network of monitoring. ANA works with the states, the different states, and we go from 5,000 points, monitoring points for water quality, and we can aggregate those information by region, by water region. So the network, as you can see, it's very broad, very large. So it's focused in different reservoirs, as you can see, as foreseen in the indicator report by United Nations. And this year, in particular, we have updated this data from the period going from 2016 to 2018. And in the middle of July, we sent the report towards the environmental data, and we came up with about 77% of all water uh, entities in Brazil, based on the previous years compared to what it was shown previous years. And as it was answered before, Brazil's data were the most complex ones, the most extensive ones that they received. And as you can see, we're a continental country. Monitoring here is still very focused in the quantity of water, but also the quality of water is getting more and more advanced. And we're increasing our number of data to show and to report and to work in that sense of water quality within our country, within Brazil, in a very coordinated way as we manage the water resources. And on goal 6.4, we have two indicators. One of them talks about the evolution, efficiency of water, and you can see the data both in reais as well as dollars. And that information is also presented in an integrated way with the entire process you've heard. It has to do with the water, economical resources. And this year, for instance, we came up with a second report for all accounts in Brazil. And the first publication that represented a regionalization. That means we came up with all accounts by macro regions, as well as the five main regions of Brazil. And that's being incorporated as we improve the report. And the other indicator that has to do with wastewater and evolution water stress in Brazil. As you can see, Brazil has got back to its track. And if you look at geographical areas, especially the Northeast transatlantic region that has the higher indexes of water stress, has room for improvement given this condition of having low water levels. And in this year in particular, when it comes to that goal and those indicators, we worked to update FAO through a questionnaire called Aquastat. We reply to that Aquastat every year to FAO. And then we had an update 1.75 for Brazil. And that discussion is integrated in concerning environmental issues. And from yesterday and even today, we're monitoring the FAO seminar about ecological contributions towards those indicators. And at last, when it comes to water efficiency, we come to a very close figure, close to $12 per cubic meter. You only have 2 minutes. Thank you, Angelo. And now we have an image that show our entire world situation, but we have areas that have more water stress. And at last, as we focus on the management activities, we have four based on resources and sanitation. As you can see, the SDG 6, you have 6.4, 6.5, and 6.8 has to do with integrated management for water resource and its four main components. We also monitor those. And this year in particular, we have updated all data with a participative project and UNEP, UNUMA, as well as members of our National Committee for Water Resources, and we came up with a figure of 63.1% as we implemented the water resource in Brazil. And in that 6.5 and 6.52 indicator, we talked about our transboundary basins. We came up with almost 100% of our basins with operational agreements, except for Iapoque's basin, which is shared with France through the agreement. And as far as transboundary basis, we don't have any more because the Guarani is not considered an operational one. So this year we updated our data by the MDR, sorry, and it was sent to the Foreign Affairs, which is our Itamaraty, and that's is furnished by UNESCO. So in summary, this year we worked very heavily, as Maria has also mentioned, to the SDG 661 app, which was developed by Inumo in comparison with in agreement with universities and colleges, and we came up with data for the extension of water bodies as well as the quantity of waters, and we discussed those numbers with the Inuma as with the intent of sharing data and to come up with the wetlands information that we have a lot in Brazil. So those data was very interesting, and that's part of the data we use. We have, for instance, these water bodies we classify as artificial or natural water bodies, and the variations that are followed up. And many times we look for a year, and we look at the historical average. And at last, the SDG 6A1 has to do with the official help. We have very little information in Brazil. We don't have consolidated data for that indicator, only the UCD data, which compiles what's the figure that the country has received, but not necessarily what it has executed. So there is a strong need to improve on that methodology. And the last indicator, which is a 6.B, which has to do with the local participation. And in Brazil, at ANA, we use data by ABGE and other basic sanitation agencies. We had our own methodology, but now we're waiting for updates to see how the data, the water collection is going to happen next year, 2021, by the United Nations. And at the end, just going over our numbers at the next year's vision. It's going to be our first version. It's in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and you can see the link for ANA, as well as the information available in our information portal, especially in the tab for different panels with indicators. We have our dashboard in Portuguese and English. That's what I wanted to share with all of you. Thanks so much for the attention. And here's all of our contact information in case you have any questions. So thank you. Thank you, Marcos. It's really a lot of information to be followed upon, followed through. So it's great pleasure seeing such a work like this, such an activity being done with all the challenges we have. But all that information is very important in order to have society follow what we're doing as we satisfy, meet the SDG goals. And now we're trying to stimulate, to motivate people to make questions in our chat so we can make the best use of our time with our guests.
Now we'll move on to Anilvaldo, Anilvaldo Miranda. He's a journalist. He's has a master's degree in development, sustainable development and environment. He's the former Secretary for Environment and Water Resources at Alagoas, and currently he is the president of the Committee for the Basin of the San Francisco River, a river that is so important for Brazil, and he also represents interstate committees for the National Committee of Water Resources. So, Anilvaldo, the floor is yours. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Once more, I'd like to congratulate you on providing this meeting here. In spite of the pandemic, life has to go on, and the challenges for sustainable management of water will not sit around and wait. I intend to contribute by bringing this scenario of what we're trying to achieve with the goals, trying to get to the sustainable development goals, and I will provide a very significant view for the reality here in Brazil on the ground, the reality as it is in the Brazilian territory. And for that, I'll talk about the water basin for the San Francisco River. This basin is quite peculiar, considering that the San Francisco River is one of the largest, if not the largest river in length that has both its spring and it gets to the ocean in the same country. The basin has 650,000 square kilometers. It goes through 6 Brazilian states, including a part of our federal district. This drainage basin goes through 3 large biomes: Cerrado, Caatinga, a typically semi-arid biome, and as it draws near to the Atlantic Ocean, it goes through the Atlantic rainforest. It covers almost 8% of the Brazilian territory, and it has a population that has exceeded 15 million inhabitants. It provides water for large cities, several different economic activities, and it has as its main waterway the San Francisco River, which has a major responsibility serving the state of Minas Gerais, one of the larger states in Brazil, which already has a semi-arid climate. It goes through almost all of the semi-arid areas in Brazil, which have the Caatinga vegetation, Caatinga biome, and it's responsible for 70% of the water demands of the 5 major regions in Brazil, one of the 5 major regions in Brazil, which is the Northeast, where we have millions and millions of people. Talking about this drainage basin is basically addressing the many challenges of the management of water resources. In the context of our committees, we say that more than a crisis of scarcity, because more than half of the basin is in a semi-arid region, we say that more than a crisis of water scarcity, what we truly face is a management crisis. And this is a very important point. So the committee is focused basically to the sense of implementing and making universal the instruments for management of water resources. We always say that discussing management of water resources and not making their instruments universal is truly an exercise in futility. It's like trying to fill a leaking bucket. This has been the main priority of the committee, which overlaps the goals known as the SDG. If we do not implement a system, a trustworthy system to grant the right of use of the waters, if we do not classify water bodies to make sure that we will oversee their quality and the goals related to it, if we do not make universal the plans for water resources, plans that are geared towards action, if we do not implement fees for the use of water, so we make it clear that water has an economic value and is a public utility. If we do not create high quality monitoring of the quality and the quantity of the water in relation to the behavior of the crime, and if we evidently do not create a structure of committees of drainage basins that are able to spread this policy of water resources, particularly in a huge territory as the Brazilian territory, we in fact will not be implementing a water management policy, a water resource management policy that is on par with the challenges of our century, which is a very difficult, complex century, resulting from man's interference on particularly on the climate, leading to this new era in terms of climate, to which we have to delve deeper in and ways to control it. So in this context, the Basin Committee uses evidently the resources such as fees, charging fees for water. This the amount of money is modest, but we try to make a lemonade out of lemons, and we try to work on projects that could be an example to be multiplied throughout the federal government, the states, and the cities in Brazil. So this is an effort to make the plan for such a large basin, to turn it into a document that can be shared with all entities, whether in the government or private companies and civil society as a whole. So in this context, the committee works with the Millennium Goals in a very concrete way. For example, when it comes to the 6.2, SDG 6.2, regarding the having hygiene and reuse of water, the committee works with small projects such as agricultural ecological cesspits, which we are conducting in a small city along the river. These are low-cost solutions that are very interesting for local communities. One of the virtues of these committees is to have this close relationship with the populations that live by the river. And this is one of the example of the hundreds of projects that we do by charging fees. And we talk to the communities, we listen from them to learn what are their desires, what are their needs when it comes to the management of water resources. We are also developing, for example, in the low area of the San Francisco River, we are developing a program in a cooperation with the National Water Resource Agency, ANA, to create a monitoring network going from upstream to downstream in the San Francisco River. So we will work with the resources and charging fees to development projects to treat wastewater. Regarding increasing the efficiency in water usage, we created a new methodology for fees, rewarding users that use technology to rationalize water use, considering that it's not fair to charge equally from people who have unequal behaviors when it comes to their efforts in rationally using waters. So our new methodology has this goal. We are also creating systems that can become an example for high quality water. So both for treatment and provision of high quality water, particularly in indigenous communities. We did it at the Pancará community, indigenous community from the outback in Pernambuco. We are working with the Cariri Chopó community, a community located in the San Francisco Park. But we also developed municipal supply systems. And this month we completed the system in the city of Pirapora to improve water supply in that city. So in this context, the committee will keep on advancing, but indirectly, it also is working with quantity and quality of water in terms of monitoring. We are quite concerned about threats that surround the San Francisco River, millions of people depending on it, particularly threats represented by dams from mining companies. In the last 3 years, we had at least 3 criminal events, 2 promoted by the Vale company from when tailings dams broke in the Doce River drainage basin and in the Paraupeba River, which is one of the tributaries to San Francisco River. Brazil cannot afford the luxury of having one of those accidents in large rivers a year. We have one in the Doce River, we have one in Paraupeba River, and one in the state of Pará with Rio Parcarena. And now we have a major debate because there are large projects that are being imposed over the drainage basin without the proper discussion and without considering the national law of water resources, which sets forth as principles for water management, participative, shared, decentralized management, which is quite clearly what is not happening right now. But when it comes to these large projects, we pretend to. There's a new dam that basin that cannot no longer provide hydroelectric power by dams. It will be a tremendous impact in a basin and in a river that has already suffered, and it has already a series of hydropower plants, and they are no longer necessary or useful because no energy can be generated from it anymore. But there's also the idea of implementing several nuclear power plants with many reactors in a river that can't effectively suffer any major impact in terms of pollution without causing a national disturbance. This river is called the National Integration River. Millions of people in the semi-arid region depend directly on this river, and they can't suffer from the threats of tailings dams and other dams, and now with major projects that are looking back to the 19th and 20th century instead of looking towards the 21st century. We need to use the large potential that we have for solar power in the Brazilian semi-arid. We need to have greater use of wind power. which is currently already substituting the hydroelectric power, and other alternatives that can effectively be a part of the generation of energy. Nivaldo, please, I need you to move towards your conclusion. Therefore, I will conclude by saying that in addition to working with the SDGs, we work with the Water Pact. So, just to give you a brief overview of what is the Water Pact, this is a pact by the committee where we intend to convene and enter into with the states that are part of this drainage basin and the federal government, aiming at creating a georeferenced basis to be used by the entire basin for water resource management, classifying the whole main waterway and their main tributaries, determining the water flows from each tributary and sub-basin, so each can plan and understand their demands in terms of water in order to harmonize and avoid conflicts for the use of water in the future, agree on the maximum demands from each state in the sense of creating the harmonization of use of water resources, deadlines to implement the fee systems, uh, deadlines to implement systems to grant rights of use, creating the integrated information system, something we are already doing. By the end of this year, we will have an information system from the San Francisco drainage basin, establishing quality standards of water quality to the San Francisco River, and determine scenarios and areas of work and deal with the crisis, particularly the scarcity crisis, in a basin that grows through the semi-arid regions such as ours. These are scenarios that are overlapping with the SDGs. I'm sorry I went a little bit over my time, but it's a lot of topics and a lot of information to cover. Everything you said is quite important, Ivaldo. We have a lot of people commenting on your presentation. We have questions for all of our participants, all of our speakers. But one comment here from Sonia that I find very interesting is when it comes to the actions in the San Francisco Basin. And Juliana saying that this was quite well explained, the way you explain it so clearly to the current situation. And a lot of people are agreeing with what you had to say. In any case, soon we will have time for a Q&A, and I'd like to invite all of you to send us questions. Now we will move on to Rafael Barbieri. Rafael Barbieri, he's a biologist and an economist. He's currently undertaking a postdoctorate in econometrics at the University of São Paulo, and he's the senior economist of WRI. So thank you for accepting the invitation. You have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you everyone for being here and for the opportunity. Can you all see my screen right now? Just one correction. I finished two postdoc studies just 6 years. So I would like to go for the third one, but it's been a while. It's been 6 years. Anyway, I'm going to talk about everything that we've done at WRI Brazil, which has to do with national infrastructure for water. I'm going to present the Cantareira and Guandu cases. We have a follow-up on both projects in the region of Victoria, as well as the city of Campinas, the metropolitan area of Campinas. So these two studies are already available on our website, the WRI website. By the way, we have the English version as well. So that's the study for the water infrastructure, both in Cantareira as well as Guandu. And the idea for natural infrastructure, it's basically just the conservation, the restoration, or the proper management of ecosystem that can enable the landscape to provide water, supply water in channels or those that are less volatile when it comes to seasonality, and also to improve water quality. So it's our habit to try and understand the sanitation system, just like that slide where you see the basic structures that are built. And the idea, the proposal for the natural infrastructure, not only the built infrastructure as well as the entire landscape. So reutilizing the landscape through the soil proper management. And that brings to us a lot of benefits for the management, the water management, as well as the conflicting use of water. For instance, 77%, I'd say from 72 to 77% of water in Brazil is used in agriculture. And then we have it for different industries and for basic sanitation. So we must always think about the integrated landscape. So the rural area, it is not only supplier of food, of fibers, of biofuels, of pharmaceutical products, but it's also a supplier of other ecosystem services where water is also part of it. So the integrated view, it really matches. It's really compatible with what Anilvaldo mentioned, which is the extreme importance of centralizing it and sharing information. There is no one better than these committees to know what are the issues and problems the regions are going through. So that's the natural infrastructure that's based on this concept of reutilizing the landscape. So it's a improved way to look at the landscape to supply resources to the system. So building up water in a better way. In our concept, so it's not a competing item. It doesn't compete with the conventional, the built infrastructure, but it's a complementary item. It leverages what we're building. So now we have a drought in the region of Cantareira, and the other picture, you have the pollution of Guandu River. So I'm not sure you're able to see the arrow. I'm trying to point to the rivers here, but we have a problem of algae as well as high uh, blurriness. So you can see drought, and we must do something about. So we know that the forest has a performance in two main roles in the water performance. So forests, they do not produce water, they consume water, but that's precisely the ability that the forest has. First of all, to absorb water. So let's say you have a region without forests, or the gravitational potential energy through rainwater. When you have forests covered with the forest heights that absorbs the gravitational impact, it makes water to be much, much more efficient. It's absorbed more efficiently by the soil. And then during the drought regions or areas, it goes with the water, retain the soil, and that really helps in management through the seasonality of water availability. And the other thing is where you can see clearly the cover, forest covering the region. You diminish erosion, and you can also diminish the amount of solids that are floating in water, and also you diminish the cost for manage and take care of water. In our studies, It's basically going through 6 stages. And the first one is the most important one, and it's the one that takes the longest. The first one is coming up with the findings along with the communities, along with different committees, along with the main agencies that are users with the main representatives, for instance, the rural producers, in order to define if there is if there are projects to restore and conserve soil that could bring in the region, that could bring expected benefits to society. And that takes usually 1 to 2 years, the entire process. And that's when we define if we're going to have resources or we have to go after resources and do the restoration of such such amount of hectares in these areas. And then we specify, we go with the baseline, or as far as the status quo goes, we're not going to do anything. And that means the basic of what we expect to be done if we don't do anything, compared to scenarios where we must restore given the budget restrictions, given any other restrictions, and given the stakeholders' interest. And then we have an estimate of our biophysical results. So once we restore, what are the benefits when it comes to the quantity of water, or when it comes to regu regulation for the water resource, and the evaluation of those benefits and costs, evaluation of the risk. And we look at the natural infrastructure,
aquela
basically just a business plan for that basin or for that region, including, by the way, from the start, just so it makes more sense, if there is a need of participation, if efficient participation of all stakeholders. And fortunately, so far, both in São Paulo's case as well as Rio de Janeiro's case, and Victoria and Campinas, we have been able to work with a lot of stakeholders, because when we say water, all of the parties who are involved, they have something to talk about, or they usually have something to worry about. So going from water basin committees, public ministry departments, or even the different state basin committees or even municipalities, depending on the water basin that we're talking about, we can count on their support, we can count on their participation. And it's really been very efficient. It's been very effective for us. And here we see an example in this graph, in this image, both in the case of Cantareira, which is that region, as well as Gandu. We have the main evaluation when it comes to sediments. So we use the invert. We have a partnership with the Stanford University, as well as Natural Capital, that has developed Invest. So the red dots you can see on the screen, those are the areas where there's the higher contribution for these sediments. So they have higher erosion. So if we're able to restore those areas, for the case of São Paulo, the movement called Waters for São Paulo, the idea was to restore 12,000 hectares, but given the budget restriction, we are only able to get 4,000 hectares. For Rio de Janeiro, the movement had a need to restore 7,000 hectares, but given the budget restrictions as well, we came up with 3,000 hectares. And then you can see the simulation for the costs in terms to uh, turbidity, 1.73 cents of a dollar per cubic meter. So it's a very low cost. And in the case of Rio de Janeiro, 8.7 cents of real per cubic meter that is treated, by the way. So the cost to treat water when it comes to turbidity, it's very low when you compare the entire cost to treat water. So the good news is that even being a very affordable service. We can show it through equations. We have to consider, for instance, that the restoration.
2 minutos, tá?
Rafael, by the way, you only have 2 minutes. Okay, no problem. So let's say the restoration is going to take 10 years, but the forest is still growing. And a natural infrastructure, it is both more efficient and it's older at the same time. So different than another conventional infrastructure, it appreciates as time goes by instead of depreciating. So I don't need to go into details, but we have a few matrices, few equations, and when you see the progressive decline, and it's not linear, and you can see the level of turbidity as well as the cost levels, they are not linear. And we can then calculate an economy and that savings, that is the cost that was avoided during the water treatment. Now, the final economic results, as you can see here, we have discount, taxes, and rates that companies use in their tariffs, in their fees review. And even though there is a high cost for restoration, there are costs that are avoided in this water restoration, and they make up for all these other discounted tax rates that are high. Even when you look at projects that take 30 years, and considering the fact that the forest is going to grow and hasn't even got to its major level of contribution. So what we can show here is that in a essential service like this, without considering all other benefits, this alone would make it worth it to restore the region. Of course, there are risks involved, so it depends on the level of the forest's ability to grow, or it depends on the restoration cost, and we have different risk levels. But as we simulated 10,000 simulations for each scenario, we come up with an average of 87 to 88% of all cases being in a positive outcome, even with the low discounted rates in the market. So that's the work done in partnership with WRI, and the IUCN, the Boticário Group, Natural Capital, and also was funded by the Fundação FEMSA. So I believe we have many elements to be discussed and be talked about, but that's the end of my presentation.
Realmente, Rafael,
So, Rafael, it
combinou bastante.
truly seems like
Primeiro,
your
olhar
presentation really matches what we
dos
saw.
outros países,
The outlook we have from other countries when we look in a global, with a global perspective, and then when you have a perspective just on Brazil, and both of you, Evaldo and you were able to bring practical ideas and that can really help the
A
SDG.
gente já tem bastante pergunta aqui.
Now, I know we have a lot of questions already,
Para a
but
gente
one
começar
question that we can use to get started
pedir que vocês
to warm
fossem
up
bem
this
breves,
Q&A session. And by the way, I want you to be very brief in your answers so we can answer as many questions as possible from our audience members for those who have already made their questions. So just to warm up, let's ask, what are the challenges if you were to choose? So if you were to choose three main points, what are the main challenges to implement these SDGs? So in each region where you are monitoring, for each practical activity or action in your region C, BH, what are the main challenges, the three key challenges to implement? And by the way, you have to consider the COVID, the pandemic, to see if it changed anything. We realize that we're going through this moment, but you could please share it maybe in a minute or two. So let's start with Maria. So three challenges to implement the SDGs.
It's a very big question. Many of my colleagues in the agencies, they keep repeating that they work with collecting data. They don't, they don't evaluate the data. And the indicators we have at the global level, it tells us about the current status, but to understand why, you need the full context, basically. Why is this particular country not managing its water resources? You need to look at the whole context. But so if I would dare making some very high-level generalizations, I would say that one of the major problems is, of course, just funds for doing so. And also a big thing, it relates to the governance of these resources and the capacity of countries to deal with the issues. And then I think one very fundamental one when it comes to natural resources management is that it ultimately it kind of crashes with our current economic system of growth. It's, of course, we need the whole challenge, and what we try to seek is this balance between development and protection of the environment, but ultimately there is a trade-off between those, and I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Muito obrigado, Maria, Marcos.
Thank you, Maria, Marcos. This is a great question, and I'll try to focus on the Brazilian situation, the experience of the Brazilian Water Agency with the indicators from the SDG. I think that the first of the main challenges that I would mention is particularly increasing local participation, cooperation, the communities at all levels, whether it's at the government level, collegiate boards, population, society, trying to integrate everyone in this process for the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's probably the main challenge. We see that some experiences at the level of the committee, at the level of the metropolitan regions are being developed, and they converge toward this SDG agenda. So the integration of all these initiatives is important and a major challenge. The second challenge I'd like to bring up is focused on the issue of Brazil as a country. I mentioned the conservation of our water systems, ecosystems. We have many changes that happen all the time. If you ask me, I remember when we launched in this year in May the new water mass basing. Every day we have a new dam being built in Brazil, a new dike. Not just one, there are many being built every day. So the process of human changes in soil and water in Brazil's still a country undergoing development, so it's quite intense. This creates a burden, this creates pollution, this creates issues for the preservation of our ecosystems that are associated to water. So this is a major challenge for all of us and for the purposes of this agenda. And the final, which be a little bit more specific to our management of water resources, is precisely increasing monitoring and integrating groundwaters in this agenda. We know that we've moved forward in the monitoring of quality of surface level water, but we still have many gaps. We have little information on groundwater, and this is reflected in the management of water resources. There is a scarcity in groundwater information. Most of the use and availability in the demand is met by surface water, but the management of groundwater is important, particularly when you think about bodies of water that go between borders, and we still do not have international agreements for the management. I hope I have explained a few of the challenges we face. Thank you, Marcos. Indeed, we are going to have an opportunity to work in this issue of groundwater with the creation of the new National Plan for Water Resources. Anilvaldo, you have 2 minutes, please. I'll be quite direct, Angelo. you asked for three main challenges. The first one, I think, is the fight to preserve our major biomes, not only in the country, but in countries as large as Brazil, particularly in the reality we face here, the regional reality. I think that the world can no longer bear this way that we face development. When we look at development only as economic growth that depends on accelerating devastation of the forests and vegetation in the planet, and an acceleration in the destruction of biodiversity. This is a suicidal equation that needs to be stopped. In Brazil, sadly, currently is a negative example because what is happening with our forests and our biomes is completely schizophrenic. There's no reason in Brazil to take down any trees or forests. Brazil has 70 million hectares of degraded lands, which could evidently be restored. We could even increase our production capacity for grains if we did our homework instead of risking our forests. The second challenge, as I've mentioned, there's no management of water resources if we do not make the instruments for it universal. Without investment in research and science, without monitoring networks, without trustworthy systems for granting rights, without plans for basins, without classifying the waterways, we can't. Talking about management in this case is an exercise in futility, and we need to ensure participative policies. And I don't think that either in Brazil or anywhere in the world right now we can have the government uh, that are only investing now. They have to use the agents in economics, and particularly the society as a whole needs to face the major challenges in climate crisis, in violence crisis, food crisis, inequality crisis, the people migration throughout the world. All these challenges have to be faced. And in this aspect, when it comes to the management of waters, this management has to be conducted locally. People who understand how the rivers work, people who live there are the ones who have that sort of knowledge. And they're the ones that need to interact with the government. To close, I'd say that this is such a major challenge that even though Brazil has a national system for water resources that has at its basis the committees of water basins, at the national committee, these committees on at 30 representatives have only the right to one representative, and Brazil has 200 committees. So in the Brazilian case, we are not recognizing our own committees. We are not, we're taking them for granted. They're the only ones that can build a consensus, they can develop the resolution of conflicts for water use, and to provide capillarity and effectiveness to the policies of water resources. We need to, in fact, have the government trusting society. Sadly, the culture of public administrations and governments are usually do not trust the the people. They talk about decentralizing, but they don't want to decentralize. They talk about participation, but they are not open to criticisms on public policies. Those are the challenges. This is I'm very passionate about this topic. Thank you, Anilvaldo. You provide very marked elements that need to be debated further so we can implement the SDGs and monitor them. Rafael, you can go ahead and give us your answer. Well, after Mr. Anilvaldo's speech, I have very little to add, but I really like what Maria had to say as well, and I'll give a clear example. So I'll try to be quick and be under 1 or 2 minutes. We have a problem in the country, which is the Brazilian legislation does not recognize adequate management, restoration, or preservation as an investment. So currently, if a sanitation company wants to restore a land to implement a forest, this will be in their cash flow as a cost, which means that they cannot use it as an investment that would, at a point, provide some tax relief and some substitution of income. But if they do that by buying drainage pipes to go to another riverway or water basin, that can be used as an investment. So there is a lack of data, there is a lack of safe research showing a cause-effect relationship between forests and improvement in water, and at the same time it is a conflict between the old economy that still cannot recognize the importance of the ecosystems, even if they are not generating cash flow, even if they're just saving money at this point, and the new economy, which is the economy that can anticipate and be ahead of the problem. The large ecosystems, they do not generate cash, they simply create savings, and you can only notice that when they no longer exist. So we need to change that because this is extremely relevant. Thank you very much, Rafael. I have comments here based on what you have all said. What is happening to our forests is an environmental crime. When it comes to social participation, they have even revoked a law regarding social participation. So we have a few comments here. But now, let's start with the questions. And the first question will go to Maria. Célia Renault is commenting, Maria. The data survey, both qualitative and quantitative, by UN using satellite imaging is very important to provide credibility to information, to enrich the available database. Are you already doing that sort of survey? Is that already being made available? If you could answer it briefly. So Maria, the floor is yours.
Yes, so Earth observation, it's used for parts of some of the indicators, but most importantly then for 661. And you can also actually look at the results all are already available online. It's 661 app. If you Google it, you will find it, and it's quite impressive actually what you find there.
Ok, é isto?
All right, is that it? Thank you. Now moving on to our colleague Marcus, we have a comment here from the representative of the Bharti Institute. He says that we need to enrich the network in the region in the Amazon in Brazil, and there's a question that you could also comment on. Another question. Maria Helena Silva would like you to comment on the issue of monitoring based on sanitation and quality, both quality and quantity of waters in large cities such as Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. Marcus, could you please? Thank you, Angelo, for the questions. Thank you for the Bharti Institute. In fact, we need to expand monitoring in all country. not only in groundwaters but also on surface waters. But we already have this year we had a great approach with CBRM with the in the sense of starting to integrate the data on groundwater from the monitoring of SDG 6, which is coordinated by the Brazilian National Agency of Waters, ANA. We still have very little monitoring of water quality. We have two ways that we do this monitoring. One is to the hydrometeorological network coordinated by us at ANA. In this network, we collect basic parameters when it comes to water quality, those that can be obtained with probes, multi-parametric probes. We also, as we survey water flow and other parameters of water quantity in the rainwater monitoring stations, we also have the basic parameters. However, when it comes to more complex parameters, such as nitrogen, cesspits, and so on, we need to have collection, we need to have laboratory analysis to access the data later so that it will be enough. And in Brazil, this is being coordinated in the last few years from 2013, 2014. And we have a program called Quali Agua, which is a cooperation. And using this program, we are progressively implementing it since 2015, 2016. We're implementing the National Network for Water Quality Monitoring. It was expected to have all sites operational by this year, which was not able to be done, but we have advanced, particularly in some states in the Amazon region. We have started monitoring, and in 1 or 2 years, we will have results from the monitoring of all parameters for this network, which we have several pieces of information. You can see the Quali Agua program on the ANA website for the entire country, including points for the Amazon region. As for the second question, when it comes to the pair sanitation and quality and quantity of water, this is very important. This is a complementary session. I'd like to invite you to participate in the event itself, Brazil Water Week, next week, where we will have a session that will discuss specifically the indicators related to sanitation. However, water resources, the situation of quality of water resources is the fruit of the situation we have in terms of sewer and sanitation, because if we do not have treatment of sewage water and wastewater, we will have very low quality of our bodies of water and a greater impact on our lakes and rivers and reservoirs. So this is also an integrated aspect. But we see that in some areas, we can, through this historical series of monitoring that started with the Agenda 2030, we see some advances starting to happen, some progress happening. We went through a serious water crisis in the last few years that had an impact on most of our drainage basins, particularly in the Northeast and Southeast, and now recently in the South, as a result of a water scarcity. This has an impact in water quality with low levels, low volumes in reservoirs, and that has an impact in quality as well. But we also see that there was, in fact, a lot of investment in the last few years in collection and treatment of sewers. We still have a lot to do to, in fact, make it universal. We have many actions, as Anilvaldo has said. Just to conclude, Angelo, I know I'm running over my time. These investments and this improvement that we had in the last few years, mapping, equipment, with this year too, and this contributed to the improvement in water quality. Sanitation is directly integrated with water quality, and every investment we make will contribute, and this will be notable.
So thank you, Marcos. And now we have two questions for Rafael. Everyone is giving compliments to all the presentations, colleagues, sending their regards, especially in this pandemic moment when we have to go through our meetings from remote locations. So I know we're going through a weird time. So Maria Lúcia, Marcela has really helped us to put this together. Anyhow, Rafael, why turbidity and not a biome demand for oxygen is the main indicator for the assessment of WRI. And when you consider the importance of rural areas as they propose the recovering of many water supply, what can we do with the materials, the soil materials? You can go ahead, Rafael. Thank you for your questions. First of all, it's a great question. It's very important, but we don't have enough data or enough models that are able to capture the cause and the effect of an intervention in restoring the environment as that indicator decreases its numbers. In the meantime, for sedimentation, the knowledge is really well advanced. So obviously, when we're talking about the restoration impacts in water quality, the most important thing to look at, as we just use one indicator, we have to remember that many cases that single indicator has already been able to sustain the viability for such an intervention in landscape. So we can imagine the amount of benefits that the forest would generate for us, regardless of the fact that we can account for it or not. So I'm sure that other elements are much more important than sediments, the organic load, the amount of chemical elements, especially phosphate materials that are coming out of fertilizers. So that would be extremely relevant. Hormones would be another important indicator for water quality. But still, we don't have enough models, mathematical models, that could help us capture the effect of that restoration or the water quality conservation. So what we do is using the ones that we already know are working, the ones that are less important. However, they are at least safe, reliable when it comes to measuring water quality. The other question, and I still consider it very important question because this type of work, when we simulate, it's actually a plan. It's a project analysis. So we always consider that restoration will happen only in areas of major degradation. Those are areas that were degraded by cattle. So we don't see restoration in a highly productive area in agriculture or when they already have forests that were planted around it. So these are cattle land. So today, as you can see, and Ivaldo mentioned, depending on the source, whether it's Embrapa or Apic, for instance, we have between 90 to 120 million hectares of pasture land that were degraded, and that represents more than the amount of pasture land in Europe. So we could use those numbers, and that erosion, the restoration of those areas, they not only contribute for quality of the water, but they could also be the restored areas for getting the producers proper coding, proper zoning. And by the way, we're producing an article about the impact and the negative impact of degraded areas in meat production in Brazil. So with that, we would be able to solve a lot of issues together by restoring those degraded areas. So I'm not sure I responded your question properly, if you're satisfied with my answers,
Ah,
but
ótimo,
that's what I understood from your
obrigado.
questions. No, that was great, Rafael. Thank you. We have to remind everyone that at the end, all of you will have final thoughts. So that's just important to highlight that your answer should be brief. And for any vote, a lot of people are giving you compliments, Anilvaldo, and they're agreeing with the aspects, the political aspects that we're going through right now. But there is a question from Carlos Schade, which is what's the percentage of the São Francisco Committee budget that are invested in social projects for the population Iberinha and water? Maybe you don't have handy all those numbers. You have all those numbers, but can you tell us how much is being invested? And the other question is, Dennis Teixeira, he sees the northwest region of Minas, especially in a region that's getting increased conflicts. How do you see the region, the upper region of Francisco? Anivaldo, please. Well, let's see. I don't have data handy, as you mentioned, but although they can be found on the committee website, www.cbhcsanfrancisco.org.br. So there you can find the precise numbers. And when it comes to our plans, Anivaldo, your data has already been put both on CBH as well as their main website. Yes, in our plan, we have diagnostics, prognostics. So it's a very dense, very deep plan with a lot of data. Where we have prognostics, and the perspectives, our goals, our objectives to be acquired. So tables of investments, something that calculates about 30.1 billions of reais of what we need from 2016 to 2025 to talk about revitalization of the San Francisco water basin. But directly answering your question now, when it comes to water quality, our committee is a champion of coming up with municipal plans for basic sanitation. We've finished and we've delivered to different municipalities that are lacking resources. We're able to give more than 60 plans. Now we're getting to a area of another 40, stage of another 40 plans for the different municipalities. And those plans, that's the first step, that's the gateway for municipalities to then make themselves available for capture resources and come up with different projects. And later, with those projects, they can capture more resources for sewer collection and treatment. But then there are other verticals in sanitation, such as urban drainage, water treatment for human supply, and also solid waste treatment. So our focus at this moment is to collect and treat the sewer because our project has to do with saving the San Francisco channel when it comes to of those any of those wastewater. And then there's a fight, there's a struggle to avoid the or deforestation. There are other chemical elements that are not desired, especially when you talk about fertilizers and the application of toxical materials. And we have no control in Brazil. And that just adds to the quality of our water. Now, it's clear that the committee is not limited to those activities, to those actions. When it comes to cooperation with different states, we're working heavily in that sense, working with Minas Gerais in the state of Bahia, and now in the state of Alagoas. When it comes to focusing precisely on added use for water, and in Alagoas in particular, we're going to work with population that will have the major benefit of what we call the Sertão channel, and the committee will fund the management model for that channel. It has 240 kilometers going with the one of the most expensive works being done in Brazil right now in that sense, but it has no management model. And what we consider there is that we need to abandon, to get rid of that culture, that to just go there and come up with a physical work, that's governance. But no, we must come up with a quality governance. There's no reason to come up with channel construction, channel work if there's no management control. And the committee obviously doesn't work with those concerns directly. And when we talk about the Northwest region of Minas, we had an agreement, a cooperation agreement with the water basin of the Verde Grande. And we're going to work with the national agency and other partners. It's a big, a major program in the city of Montes Claros, precisely to restore an area that was really impacted, especially when they planted eucalyptus trees. But it's an area that really needs to be restored urgently because they account for the supply of water in that big city in Minas Gerais. And that's obviously important for the well-being of the entire population. When you talk about the northwest of Minas Gerais, we're also working with that issue of degraded areas. In the northwest of Minas, the region that I mentioned, there's an area of 100,000 hectares of degraded land due to pasture land. And by the way, I want to thank Rafael because he had a great timing to work with me. So my morning, I was very happy this morning when they said it's not 70 as I mentioned. So I was way off, way behind. So it's up to 120 million hectares of abandoned land, degraded land, precisely because of opportunism, trying to grow economically speaking in a non-urbanized way, and it's not sustainable. So we need to really focus on those degraded areas and get rid of those old-fashioned activities, actions of deforestation. Thank you, Anilvaldo. Even with Jesmar, as he places his question here for us, and it's a very interesting question, but at the same time, I'm looking at his question. It's focused. Uh, it's probably more for Onivaldo, but his question opens a debate, a discussion for us. What he says is that with so many divergences, because of course we can talk about the different divergences when it comes to management by water basin and also by the SDG goal. But how does the monitoring can show? How does the monitoring show that year by year? And by the way, he mentions that in his understanding, the United Nations parameters, the SDGs for these indicators, they do not reach the local reality. So that is open for Maria or for Marcos when it comes to the monitoring. But let's start with Maria. So feel free to comment in that issue.
Yes. So I think the water sector, it's in general particularly challenging. I mean, everyone uses water, and I mean, the great challenge didn't make it to the top three when I listed them earlier. But I mean, one really major challenge is it's of course the issue of fragmentation, that it's dealt with by so many different sectors and by so many different at so many different levels. I mean, we have the water basins, but I mean, in many countries they work according to administrative boundaries. It's really a great challenge, and I mean, I work in a coordination mechanism, so I can really relate to that. And it's I mean, coordination is really very challenging. Just getting everyone on the same page. And I don't know, sometimes I think that the human being is not, you know, to survive a very complex society, we need to, you know, compartmentalize issues, which is of course disastrous for water. In terms of the monitoring, I really agree with you that the SDG indicators, they are really not sufficient to reach to address particular challenges in countries. And I think really the main value of the SDG indicators, it's for communication. If we ask ourselves, what should we do to make, the SDGs happen? Basically, we need to convince, or we need to get politicians to make sound decisions. And how do we get these politicians to listen to us? I think that's the main question. And I mean, it's partly about showing a monetary value to it. If there's a dollar, it's easy to take into consideration. I think that's why the work done by Raphael is so important. That we are able to speak the language of politicians to show there's the economic value of doing different things. But then the other thing, it's about the voters. I mean, politicians, they listen to money and to voters. How do we get all these voters, all these normal people around to demand from the politicians that they do something? And I think the first step there, it's really for them to understand the issue and to equip them with like the tools to go to their politicians and demand. And this is where the SDG indicators may be very useful. They're relatively easy to understand. And there's one number, and you can compare it with your neighbors to see like, oh look, my neighboring country is doing a lot better. Why is that? And I think that's really the value of these SDG indicators. And I think I used up my 2 minutes there. Over.
Muito obrigado, Maria.
Thank you very much, Maria. You remind us that we are at a moment where we will have municipal elections, so this debate can contribute so that our citizens will in fact be aware and think about the importance of water, how important the SDGs are. The citizens might be reminded that important actions in the city of São Paulo, for example, that has a water security law, Campinas has a municipal policy for water resources, and so on. These actions may be triggered in several municipalities. We certainly have further examples of that. But maybe we will have to ask you not only to answer questions, to go into, and then we can go back to Maria for it, but also make your final remarks as well. And reinforcing it, that the question that was asked by Gismar, there is a major issue when we think about water resources. The SDGs can really be on track with everything that happens daily. Do we need to have changes? So Marcus, please answer the question and add your final remarks. And I'd already like to thank you for participating. Thank you, Angelo. It's great for us at ANA to be able to be part of this process. It is very rewarding to throughout this conversation in the last few years in contact with the agencies at the UN, the custodian agencies, those that are actually organizing the data with such care and such effort. Maria Schade is definitely one of the people really responsible for this monitoring, but in each custodian agency we have people who are dedicated with data from all countries. Brazil is not different. We see that this agenda permeates all of our action, and throughout the next few years we have been trying to adapt whenever possible the methodologies to bring it closer to the situation in Brazil. We know that Brazil is a very diverse country. We have very different issues in different regions, from north to south to east to west. We go from semi-arid to rainforests. We have seaside, we have countryside, we have indigenous populations, we have populations who live in slums, our populations in vulnerable situations. So if we reach 99.9% of sanitation, that's where we can get, we need to get to that 0.1%. That's still a large population, a considerable population that needs to get sanitation, that needs to have power, that needs to to find a source of income. So all of this is involved in the SDGs. So we need to consider the reality in the country. We need to look at different situations in different areas and trying to bring this discussion to the basic resources. We work with the states. We know that water management is made both by the federal government and by the state governments, all 26 states and the federal district, according to our constitution. But it's a work of cooperation. And lastly, I'd like to extend my thank you to Josimar for his contribution. In Brazil, we monitor in a partnership with several other federal institutions, IPE, and there are lots of agencies that are focused on the metrics. They have a very interesting work when it comes to the goals, to the indicators. We are trying to update the indicators, and not only that, but update what actions, what issues we need to consider to implement actions to reach the goals in a focus with the new water management plan that is coming out next year. And this is something we need to discuss and present to society in the participative process that will be developed throughout the next year, and we'll start this month. We will start having webinars for the national plan for water resources. So I'd like to extend an invitation to everyone to be a part of this initiative, to participate in this process. IBGE has a web portal that I'll leave available for the odsbrazil.gov.br, odsbrazil.gov.br. You can get information on all SDGs, not only SDG 6. This is a cross-sectional area integrated to all goals. So all 17 goals in the agenda to 2030. In the ANA information, we are the focal point. They are updated. They are sent not only to the UN outside of Brazil, but in Brazil as well, so we can have an effective coordination in the government structure for all this monitoring, so we can advance in the sense of supporting Brazil as much as possible. We are facing a complex scenario with several issues, lots of environmental issues, as we've discussed here, but we need to keep on these efforts to progress as citizens of Brazil. So I invite all of you to be a part of this process. So lastly, thank you for the opportunity to be here participating in this debate. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcus. I'll ask you to be brief because we still have Maria to close with her. So, Anilvaldo, please, your final comments. Reflecting on the question by Josimar, here's the thing. I think we are in a trap, in a sort of a perverse trap here. I think that happens in a different way throughout countries in the world. But in a country with such a large population, such as Brazil, there's always some level of difficulty of having this interaction between internal policies in the national territory and the interaction with what happens going beyond our borders, particularly in a country where much of our frontiers are touching one side we have the ocean and the other we have forests. Brazil has few physical borders with other countries. I think that this also leads to another dilemma in our policy. Our foreign policy has always been quite competent, our Brazilian diplomacy, but it has always been for external use, as if foreign policy was simply dedicated to, let's put it this way, to implement the views of certain countries beyond the borders. And I think that this is a terrible mistake. I think that our foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the ministry, should refocus that. We need to have uh, the inverse flow, a two-way flow, so that foreign policy in Brazil will be known by Brazilians. My reason to say that is Brazil has signed I don't know how many international agreements in biodiversity, is a part of all the programs of the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals program. Everything is quite important. It is important to be a part of all of these agreements for the Convention for Protection of Oceans. But however, to what extent is the Brazilian people aware of that? Almost not at all. So the country signs these agreements, but the people do not know what are the obligations that the country has undertaken on behalf of its people, its territory, its population before the international community. So I imagine the work that Maria has, which is probably quite challenging, because a lot of people do not know what is an SDG, particularly when it comes as a simple acronym. So if you think about the people living at the side of the river, how many people do you think know what is an SDG? How many of the committees for the basins have debated it, or city committees have debated it? At times something comes up, for example, after the Rio 90 or Rio 90 plus 20, there were many goals that came up after those meetings. I remember the sustainable agenda in Brazil for 2 weeks, I don't know how many cities, and all of that simply disappeared in the dust of time. So I think that this interaction between what are the commitments undertaken by the country and how it actually tries to implement it, this can only be done when we have a major policy for communication and for engagement. I think that this needs to be put forward for our community taking care of our foreign policy. We need to have good foreign policy, but we need to clarify and make it very clear for our domestic population on what are the statutes, what are the agreements, what are the conventions that we are participating in, and how can the population be a part of foreign policy in the sense of making the commitments that we are getting into be implemented here and open a greater space for interaction with international agencies. Just a brief example. If you can conclude it, please, Nivaldo. We have a collaboration with the Inter-American Institute for Agriculture. We did a great project for cooperation with them, with the use of resources. However, the state bureaucracy nipped it in the bud because it said that the Basin Committee, since as it's not a legal entity, and it's associated to a social society association that is not for profit, you can't do it. You have to go through the city, you have to go through the state, the federal government, but the committee itself can't do it. And the state's bureaucracy, with its closed up vision that is not open to new ideas, nips these possibilities in the bud. Why can't the committee cooperate with an international body? This is not imaginable. You can legally find solutions, but it's easier to simply nip it in the bud. Thank you, Anilvaldo. So I'd like to thank you all for this opportunity and say that effectively people should not give up on the national law of Brazilian waters. Our national law is one of the most important laws in this country. If this was our script, the if this was an adventure, it would be a script for a wonderful movie. It just needs to be put into action. It needs to become a reality. It needs to be brought to life by civil society, by economic agents, and implemented by the public administration. And we need investments for that in management of water resources and in the future. This is what we call well used resources. So thank you very much. Sorry for being so emphatic on it, but we're facing such difficult times. We need to be emphatic in explaining some truths that are very dear to us and are difficult to mature in society. And as a journalist, as a social communicator, I know that one of the most difficult things for the human species is to change behavior. But we believe that we will get there someday. Thank you.
De veemência para que a gente possa ter a nossa política
So
respeitada.
thank you. I think we need to be pungent in this topic, as you mentioned, and all this work shows that we have ways to be followed. And Rafael, now it's your turn to have your final thoughts. If you want to answer any of those questions, feel free to do so as well. Listen, I don't think I'm apt to respond to answer that question. I think it's more appropriate for Maria, Anilvaldo, and Marcos. However, I'm going to share my final thoughts very quickly. So the water resource, it is in its conception, in its own nature, it's a resource. So in its conception, in its definition, it's an object of competition for its access, and at the same time, it's to be shared. So we can only advance in water management, and especially in water safety, when we in fact have all elements, all decision-making bodies together, along within a participative management that is not centralized and that it can be shared. Not because that's the most efficient, if you will, but because in the resource conception, you can see, implicitly speaking, there is the need to share it. Otherwise, if there's no sharing, there's going to be another relation to it, which is competition. So it's extremely important for us to have that vision. And obviously, the importance of United Nations, the importance of ANA, which has, throughout the last few years, brought up the knowledge, a key knowledge, and has gone, obviously, from the water basin committees that represent the local and the regional knowledge, and that is all key and that's essential for us to be able to, in a country that uses only 2% of its water availability, and that's increasingly faced conflict episodes, and in a country that is between the 10th economy in the world with over 200 million people, 50 million people without proper sanitation, without proper sewer systems. So that's indeed an aberration, a statistical anomaly, and we need to change that. Thank you, Rafael. So we're just going to have the final thoughts of Maria. So please, Maria.
Yes, thanks. So I think I covered a lot in my last intervention, but used to recall that to conclude that monitoring it's just a means to an end. We need the information on water systems to be able to better manage them. and also to just what Anilvaldo was saying about communicating. So first, I think that the SDGs, of course, they build on things that was already there, and those things that are already there are probably more important. But the hope with SDGs is, of course, that local communities can use it in their work, in their to take them and apply them on their priorities, to see that we're part. This is the whole world are thinking about this, and hoping that that will strengthen each and every community working to improve the environment or the water resources. So it's more like a source of inspiration. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it's really about how do we put forward our data so that the normal person understand it and can use it. And I mean, it's really key. And I think we are technical people and we struggle a bit when we speak with, the general public. And we should really think about that. And I mean, from the point of the UN and especially UN Water, so monitoring and reporting is one of our focus areas. And the other one is communication and awareness raising. And for that, we have the World Water Day and soon coming up the World Toilet Day. So it's really spreading the messages to normal people. It's really key, and I think that will help us also to manage if people to understand the importance of ecosystems and why we need to keep them. And I think it's there's also these great initiatives with civil society participating in monitoring efforts as a both to gather data, which is good for the managers, but also for them to learn about it and care more about them so that they can pressure their politicians. Thanks. And thank you so much for this very interesting discussion and for the opportunity to speak. It's been very interesting 2 hours. Thanks.
So truly, Maria, we also want to thank you for your participation, and Anilvaldo's and Rafael's participation, Marcus Fuckner's and ANA's as well. And it seems to me that we're leaving this meeting rich with information, with many issues to be thought over. And by the way, in Brazil, in particular, when we talk about municipal elections, we have to talk about water safety. Each municipality need to worry about this. The society to be part of it in order for all candidates and also the elected candidates, they can worry about and cooperate with the implementation of the SDGs. And I would like to also to reiterate that recently ABS, the Hydro, and I made it available for us as well as the YouTube channel. We released a note saying exactly that we need to strengthen our water efforts in water governance. And we created a protocol to monitor the governance of water activities. And that has to be implemented, that must be made sensible by the organizations. And it's important to use that protocol, but at the same time, in particular, it has to monitor our governance. We have to monitor all processes so we can have results in management politics and management policies. So I would like to thank you all for being part of it, for accepting our invitation to be part of this seminar. So we'd like to highlight again that people still have time to participate during Water Week next week. So thank you all. Wishing you the best and congratulations for this discussion, for your presentations. And we really, really appreciate it to all of our sponsors as well and ABES for putting this program, putting this event together. So wishing you the best. See you next time. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Rafael, Marcos. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria.
Bye.